Welcome to Casual Talk. My name is Mimi Suhartanto. In this Casual Talk, we have conversation about Christian living, theology, culture, and anything that matters in life. And today, I am in the office of Dr. Glenn Kreider. He is the acting chair and professor of theological studies at Dallas Theological Seminary. He is also the editor-in-chief of Bibliotheca Sacra. That's the publication of DTS. And Dr. Glenn Kreider has been teaching theology in theology classes in DTS for about 37 years, that long. And the summer of 2018, I took his class, and that class is really life-changing. I would say that I learned so much from him. Without him knowing, probably that's a life-changing lesson that I learned from him. So today, I'm going to ask him a question, and he will answer in the area of the role of women in the church and in general. So before we begin, Dr. Kreider, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and why do you decide to become the theology professor at DTS?
The really quick and simple answer is that they invited me to become a professor. My wife and I grew up in Pennsylvania. We're not from Texas. And we came to seminary back in the mid-1980s, planning to do a THM at DTS and then going into pastoral ministry. And while I was here, I realized, I came to the end of the THM and realized I probably knew just enough to be dangerous, and decided I'd like to do a PhD. I love school. I'm pretty good at it. It's the one thing I could do, and then I knew I was okay. I got the chance to pastor for a couple years in the area. We still live in the town, Cedar Hill, south of here, where I pastored for a couple years. Did the PhD and was invited to begin teaching part-time as an adjunct in 1994, which is where you come up with the amount of time.
37. I do my math.
And started doing full-time then as on the tenure track in 2001. So, I mean, really, I love theology. I came to understand in my second year in the THM program, when of course I took on theological method, that I came to appreciate that I'm a theologian, that's what I do. And where I do it isn't as important as how I do it. So I've had the incredible privilege for all those years now to be able to do so here. I love DTS. I'm a double graduate of this place. And just, I'm grateful for the privilege of being here. And for the privilege of talking to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm sure you touch many lives here as a professor, as students graduated and they go back to their own respective churches. I'm sure you produced many good pastors and good ministers of the gospel.
Yeah, I just had that conversation a couple of times recently. I'm pretty confident 2 years after I'm gone, the school will not remember that I existed. But we do get the chance to touch people's lives, and that's the legacy of theological education, that we touch lives that touch lives that touch lives.
That's right, right.
I've never been to Indonesia, but I feel like if something I said was helpful in your ministry, that's a win for me.
Yes. So one day probably you can visit Indonesia and taste all the coffees that are available there. So continuing the conversation, you are the expert of theology and you're also observing the culture. In fact, the class that I took from you is about trend and contemporary culture, and we see it from the biblical perspective. And what do you think right now the trend and out there for the role of women, just in general, not necessarily in Christianity, but just in general as you see? And what do you think is the cause for that? What do you think?
So, yeah, that course in theological method stoked in me the desire to learn how to do theology well and to understand that theology is always done in a cultural context. That for Christians, the role of culture is not simply the context in which we translate the gospel and theology, but it actually is the context in which we do theology. So it's important for us, wherever we are, to recognize the role that culture plays, to recognize that we are enculturated beings, to recognize that we live in the world and we're influenced by. It's like asking a fish what it's like to swim in water. They have no idea. But because we are so immersed in the culture, I'm born and raised in the United States of America. I recognize that I'm coming to your question, that the culture of the States is not monolithic, it's diverse. And in the limited amount of time I have served outside of the States, in Hong Kong and China and in New Zealand, also in Canada, but I'm increasingly aware of how important it is to understand the culture in which we serve. So I'll answer your question in the context of my cultural experience in the United States of America. I think the feminist movement, and I don't want to lay the blame, or the blame is not the right word, the credit. But so, I mean, in my lifetime, I've watched the culture of the States become more open to and more aware of the marginalization of women and minorities. And that increasingly there is an attempt, increasingly there's a recognition, and then the attempt to provide opportunities. And that as the role of women, so things happened in America, World War II, when factories needed employees, women went to work. And once the doors are open, it's really hard to close them again. And once there are exceptions to rules, it's really hard to argue for rules. So I think the need for workforce and the opportunities that have followed it are the answer to your question. There were no women who served as police officers. There were no women in the military. There were no women as CEOs. We had a very top-down patriarchal culture in the States. That the so-called glass ceiling, women could get to here but not here. That ceiling has been shattered. It's been shattered for people of color with the election of Barack Obama, which is another whole set of pushback and conversation. But I really do think the opportunities for women have been expanding as there has been the need for women. It would also point out that in the educational system, this overlaps a little bit with what happens in Christianity, that increasingly women make up more than 50% of university and college programs in almost every field.
How about here in DTS?
At DTS, so in the time that I've been here, I started here just after DTS had started to allow women to study here. It opened the enrollment.
When was that? DTS
It was in the late 70s. I think but originally when women were admitted to DTS, they were admitted as non-degree students, and they were here in the summer. And the goal was to provide training for wives of missionaries. But once women were admitted, then it's pretty hard not to grant degree status to them. That I think one of the first women graduates of DTS was in the early 1980s, might have been 85. When I came here, there were just a handful of women in the THM program. Now we have a whole host of degrees, and we're pushing 50%. We're above 40%. Of women in the student body.
Almost half of the students here are women.
Which then raises the question you didn't ask, but then that
probably I will ask next.
That means if you're providing education, you have to provide opportunities to use that education.
That's right. And
And then once the doors are opened, And I don't mean that in any negative sense at all. But
Yes.
once the doors are open and opportunities are provided, then opportunities can continue to be provided. So
That's
back in the days when women were not in a degree program, and I'm not sure, I don't know for sure if the tuition was the same. That's one situation. But now when women pay the same tuition that
That's
men
right.
pay, get the same degree, the real challenge for the church in the States is to provide opportunities for women to serve in a Christian subculture that hasn't been very open to
That's
that
right.
possibility.
That's right. So how do that changes affect the Christians overall, the evangelical Christians, and the relationship between men and women in the church setting or in parachurch or anywhere in a Christian circle? How do you observe that?
Yeah, the church in the States has tended to be, particularly the conservative evangelical church, the Bible-focused folks, has tended to have a pretty clear distinction between what the roles of men and women. That, to use the language, I don't like the language, but the language that's been used to describe this, from complementarianism to egalitarianism, that the tendency has been towards a more complementarian position, which means that men and women...
So, Dr. Kreider, our listener is really lay people. They don't go to seminary. Can you define the term? What do you mean by egalitarian? What do you mean by complementarian?
So the complementarianism is the label that was used to describe relationship between men and women where they are equal in worth and value, but there's a hierarchy of roles. And that hierarchy of roles can be everything from limiting the office of pastor to men or elders, but for much of our history, it's been actually limiting any position of authority and leadership to men. So, and there are still people in that camp today who would say a woman should not be in a political office. So Vice President of the United States is a woman.
Yeah.
And there are people who think that's inappropriate. The position of the seminary is that the only limitations are senior pastor and elder of a church.
Yes.
Everything else is open. Egalitarians, on the other hand, say not only that men and women are equal in worth and value, but they have all the same opportunities and all the same roles. And that this has increasingly been, in the last couple of decades, a real battleground in the States between people who are open to women serving in a variety of roles, and a variety of roles would be on this side, and those limitations. And then the question often is, so what is the basis for these distinctions, and where are the lines to be drawn? And again, the institution at which I teach and the view that I hold is that the only line that should be drawn is the limitation of limitation of men to be elders, and the role of senior pastor. But to also tell you, the role of senior pastor is not a biblical office. It's made up, and it's a function of cultures.
That's right.
And because usually the argument is because a senior pastor should be an elder. And that actually becomes another part of a battleground, because what does it mean to be a pastor? That term pastor or shepherd in the scriptures is not an office but a function. And so that one can be one could be a pastor, a shepherd, a caregiver, and not have pastor on the job description and the job title.
That's right.
And so that I don't think there's any reason why women can't serve in that. I don't think there's any reason why women can't preach and teach within this kind of a structure. And I forget now what your question was.
Okay, I was asking you to define the complementarian and egalitarian. I guess in a family setting, the egalitarian would agree with women earning money and working to be successful in career while the husband staying home, raising the kids and managing the home. And probably that will not be accepted in the complementarian mindset. So
the relationship between the church and home and the world in which we live, those three foci are those foci are really the point. And that the closer one is to the complementarian, even the patriarchal wing, the patriarchy male dominated, is that you usually find male authority in the home, male authority in the world around us, and obviously male authority in the church. Whereas the egalitarians tend not to care whether the roles of men and women are. So in my own story, my wife was the major wage earner all the way through my education, and to this day, we make decisions together, which is a more egalitarian way. She's an equal voice, and in all kinds of ways. I'm not kidding about this. A more authoritative voice in decision making than I am. She makes decisions really well, really quickly. I'm slow and struggle with decision making. So what I've learned over the years is that it would be better for us and better for our family to at least hear her input and to make those kind of decisions together. We actually function that way, and these people over here find this a problem because they think the final authority should be the man. He's the head of the household. That just doesn't work for us.
So more like a mutual submission in the marriage relationship.
So to use biblical language, it's that Ephesians 5 language that comes out of being filled with the Spirit, submitting to one another out of fear or out of reverence for Christ.
So back to the feminist movement, Dr. Kreider. Do you see any positive impact that feminist movement bringing to Christianity and evangelical Christians today, or more negative, or is it like the feminist movement is actually kind of like balancing the misogynistic attitude of the fundamentals and the chauvinistic leadership of church leadership somehow?
Yeah, since you use misogynistic and chauvinist, I'm not going to have to define those terms.
I hope the listener will understand that.
I think you are right. And of course, every movement has strengths and weaknesses. And I'll give you what I think is a pretty significant weakness. The great strength of the feminist movement is that it has provided humanization and dignity and respect for and to women. It's called attention to the tendency toward marginalization of women, to the I would use the term abuse of women, that in the States in recent years, as this become more and more aware of the incidence of the degree of abuse, and by abuse I don't merely mean physical abuse, as horrible as that is, but emotional and spiritual abuse.
That's
and dehumanizing, demeaning of people. The feminist movement has made that just not acceptable. And it's brought to our attention the degree to which misogyny and chauvinism have dominated. I think the feminist movement has helped our country to understand the great asset that is 50% plus of the population. That to recognize that that we have lost. Otherwise, we would have lost the incredible contributions women have made in the sciences and in all fields of all the disciplines. So I think the positives have been really helpful. The women got the right to vote is in the early part of the 20th century. It's just almost shocking that New Zealand was decades before us, the first place where women got the right to vote. And finally in the 20s here. And then it took another 40 years before African Americans were given the right to vote in a country that has claimed that all people are created equal. Wow. It's shocking. And just, so that a lot of that's at the, those two things come together, the feminist movement and the civil rights movement, which has been really helpful. I think one of the negative impacts of the feminist movement is that in a lot of ways, women are now being encouraged to be like men, and that leadership and authority are the focus. And for Christianity, I think, quite frankly, this is a problem because this obsession with leadership seems to be at cross purposes with our Savior, who was obsessed with servanthood, and that to somehow say, but if you're a servant, you're a leader. I think it's oxymoronic. Because servanthood and leadership are mutually exclusive, and that doesn't mean that leadership is a problem. It just means an obsession with. So whenever I hear somebody say, I cringe even more when it comes from a woman. So who are you leading? I wanted to say, no. But the better question would be, who are you serving?
That's right. Yeah.
Because that's what Jesus. That the greatest is the one who is a servant, and the greatest of all is the one who is a slave of all.
Yeah,
as my mentor, Prof. Hendricks, used to say, who taught here for a long time, taught most of us how to study the Bible, most of the faculty at Dallas Seminary. He used to say, it's easy to talk about being a servant, but your real understanding of servanthood is how you respond when somebody treats you like one. That I think that's been one of the negative impacts of the feminist movement. That it's said to women. Ironically, it's said to women that your goal should be to be like the men who were your oppressors, instead of saying, here's a way forward that does honor the differences between men and women. And they are different. If you ask me to explain how we are different, it's hard to tell. But generally speaking, there are differences between men and women. But I think the other part of it might be a negative, is that sometimes we view all men and all women as if we're all the same. When in reality, my wife is a whole lot different from a lot of women, and I'm different from a whole lot of men. And the individuality, that's where the strength lies.
Yes. So the driving force inside should not be like revenge. Like the men used to oppress the women, and now it's like the women wanting to rule over them. It's not supposed to be like that, but it is servanthood. The more that we are like Christ, that the more that we're in a leadership position, the more that we want to serve and to submit, just like Christ himself. Yeah, that's very good, your point in bringing that up. And Dr. Kreider, I remember I had a classmate here at DTS. He's a white male American, and he said that it is very difficult for me right now, very confusing, very challenging to live as a white male American Christian with the Me Too movement and with the racism issue, and kind of like the society and people like wanting to pacify the man, and that's why the men now kind of like more passive compared to like 50 years ago. The women are more like more aggressive and more taking charge, and men are left like passive and don't know what to do. In my experience also, I see men that are more passive now compared to the generation like my dad's generation. Do you see that as well here? What do you think? What's going on?
It is hard for me to answer the question of whether men are more passive than in the past. Yeah, I think with the demise of chauvinism and the manly man, I think that actually is a good thing. That in my years growing up, in the culture in which I grew up, and then I moved to Texas, and Texas is a real man's man.
Cowboy.
Yeah. So that manliness, masculinity, let me say this first. Masculinity and femininity are culturally defined. They're not biblically defined at all. That the characteristics of masculinity and femininity are always emerging out of the culture in which men and women live. Now, it is true that 50 years ago, men were aggressive, that a real man was a man who shot things, had carried a gun. But you know what also came along with that? The oppression and abuse of women and children.
Yes.
What also came out of that was, this would have been before 50 years ago, but actually not, well, what I was going to say, the extermination of Native Americans who were here long before white men showed up, and the enslavement of African Americans, and that even 50 years ago, as hard as it is to understand, in the United States of America, that it was in the 1960s that the civil rights movement actually began to officially treat people of color as equal to white people.
That's right.
So the Me Too movement has opened our eyes to the pervasive abuse that has been hidden for so long.
Yes.
And then the Church Too movement, which followed it. I think it's really tragic that Hollywood and the business community launched Me Too, and the church followed with Church Too, basically saying, hey, abuse happens here too, and probably about at the same
Can
level.
you explain what is the Church Too movement, Dr. Kreider?
So Me Too was a movement acknowledging the rise, the reality of sexual abuse and physical abuse of women.
That's right.
And so major Hollywood figures lost their jobs, major political figures lost their jobs because of inappropriate behavior, and rightly so.
Yeah.
The Church Too movement came along just not very long afterwards, and women who had been abused in the church by church leaders, many of them, or by their husbands, or by just members of the church, to say, this is true in the church as well. So what was true in the broader culture was also true in the church. In that, just a couple of years ago, the Houston Chronicle published a list of, I think, about 600 leaders of churches in Texas that have been guilty of criminal activity in physical and sexual abuse, a number of high-profile cases. And so that, and all of that's been helpful. If we believe that we are to walk in the light as he is in the light, that actually shining the light on those dark corners where abusers hide has been really good for all. I say to a white man who is intimidated by Church Too or Me Too, I say, here's the easiest way to avoid being accused of being an abuser. Don't abuse.
Yeah.
But I think the other related question here, the other related idea here, the other related phenomenon here is that with the acknowledgement of those hidden sins and the whole host of people, I'll come back to the racism in a moment, this whole host of women who are being trained to do ministry, that there appears to be a shrinking pool of jobs for white men. That in our, so we have a PhD program and a D-Min program. D-Min or D-Admin? You're D-Min.
D-Admin.
You're D-Admin. Doctor of Educational Ministry, DMin, Doctor of Ministry. The two degrees are pretty close. Different coursework. Because evangelicalism has been a couple of cultural cycles behind. In the workforce today, in major corporations in the States, you don't find a major corporation that is male-dominated any longer. There are at least the goal of having a leadership body that's both men and women. Most evangelical schools are largely male-led, and the faculty is largely white males. That has to change. We as an institution have intentionally recruited minorities and are intentionally recruiting women as well. And so part of me would say that a person who thinks being a white male is a challenge, is a recognition that your privilege is not there any longer. That you used to be able to go to the top of the class. The backside of that, which is a little disconcerting, is that sometimes institutions and organizations would hire less qualified people to have diversity. That's a bit of an issue. With the race question, as there is more and more recognition that the civil rights movement didn't actually bring equal rights to people of color, and that the whole white privilege thing, every time I talk about white privilege in classrooms at Dallas Seminary, there are white males who become angry because they think white privilege means that we should feel guilty about being white males. That's not what white privilege is. White privilege just merely recognizes that when I walk into the room as a white person and my colleague walks into the room as a black person, we are seen differently. And we are treated differently. The whole police shootings, sure, the police sometimes shoot white people, right?
That's right.
But the way we are treated is, even though the Civil Rights Movement in 1965, the Civil Rights Act said this should not happen, it continued. Change happens gradually and slowly over time. And I don't want to be too much of a jerk and say to a white man, you should kind of get over yourself. But the changes are good, especially for those who are not in the dominant culture in America. Cities in America are rapidly diversifying. We're probably a decade or so away from Texas being majority non-white, and it makes the mission of the church. It makes even prior to COVID. It makes exciting for the mission of the church. We no longer have to, from where we sit here today. I don't have to go to another country to interact with people of a variety of cultures. I can walk from here to interact with Filipino culture, and African American culture, and Hispanic culture. I'd have to go pretty far to get to Chinese, but they live largely to the north of here. So I think the changes have been exciting, and I really think change is difficult in the process where it happens, to realize that, that's what everybody on the planet is wrestling with. In
So the move is more toward humility, and then more like self-introspection, and then changing that's not good in the past, and to progress toward more humility and treating others with equality, not like the white male privilege anymore in the past. Dr. Kreider, I want to go back. Before you mentioned about women, actually it's okay to preach, right? But then in 1 Timothy 2, 11 to 15, Paul said that I prohibit women to teach men and to have authority over men. And then the reasoning, he went back to Genesis, because Adam was created first, and it was not Adam that was deceived, it was Eve. So does that mean that when Paul go back to the beginning, to the creation, it is like the prohibition, he make that transcultural, it is applied to any seasons, any culture, it is like a permanent. So what's your view on that?
That's a view that patriarchalist and harsh or strong complementarians make. And if we take those couple of verses out of the context, not only the context of 1 Timothy, but out of the context of the Bible, I think that interpretation has merit. But when we put those couple of verses back in the context of 1 Timothy and in the context of the Scripture as a whole, then there is reason to wonder about that. This is true of any text of Scripture, that taken out of its context, it is often used in a way that it wouldn't be used in its context. So the first thing I would say is that the Apostle Paul wrote to Timothy. The Apostle Paul wrote a number of other letters too. So the Apostle Paul in 1 Timothy couldn't, and I'm hesitating only because I could think of an example where he could, but he couldn't, no, that's not true. In 1 Timothy 2, Paul could not contradict a universal principle that he made somewhere else. He could have instructions for Timothy in the church in Ephesus that are different from his instructions to the church in Rome or the church in Corinth. But so let's go to Rome first. There's pretty strong evidence that the letter that he wrote to the church in Rome was carried to Rome by Phoebe, who read it to them. So here would be a woman who's well respected in the church, maybe even a deacon in the church, who is reading the authoritative Scripture to the church in Rome. In 1 Corinthians 11, to the church in Corinth, Paul encourages women in the church in Corinth to pray and prophesy. He instructs that their heads need to be covered. That's an area of some dispute too. So that when he says in 1 Corinthians 14 that in all the churches women are to remain silent, that can't contradict chapter 11. So I think the easy answer there, and then we'll come back to Timothy, because I think these two are parallel. In 1 Corinthians 14, he gives instructions of how to evaluate and test prophets. And the way you test and evaluate prophets, according to Deuteronomy, is that a prophet has to speak what is true.
That's right.
And it must correspond to what has previously been revealed, or at the very least, it can't contradict the Scripture. Which means, in order to evaluate the claims of a prophet, people have to know the Scriptures. The women in Corinth didn't know the Scriptures. They hadn't been trained. That didn't mean they can't speak for God. That didn't mean they can't prophesy, because there are a lot of women prophets in the New Testament. And prophets speak authoritatively for God. But when it comes to evaluating the claims of a prophet, women are to remain silent. Does that mean women are forever to remain silent? No. You would train the women in the Bible and theology so that they would be able to participate. The fact that it took until the 1970s, which is 50-some years in Dallas Seminary's history, before women were ever admitted to the program here, shows how patriarchal the world has actually been. To think that women don't need Bible and theology to teach children, like, oh my goodness, anybody can do what I do, teaching adults. Teaching children is incredibly challenging and incredibly important. So what's going on in 1 Timothy? I think and my colleague Sandy Glahn has done a lot of work on the church in Ephesus. And I think she's right that what's in view in 1 Timothy is a response to the Artemis cult in Ephesus, where Artemis was deemed more authoritative because she was created before her brother And that I think what she says what Paul was doing here is saying, no, the Artemis wasn't first. Adam was before, the man was before the woman.
Yeah.
But that, which takes us back then to the book of Genesis, where in chapter 1, the emphasis is that the two were created. They are both in the image of God. They are both have the same functions. In chapter 2, the man is created first, and then she is created from him. Back to 1 Corinthians 11, that has nothing to do with hierarchy. It has nothing to do with authority. That's order of creation, and it's parallel to the Father and the Son, the eternal generation of the Son. So I think what's in view here is, and let me say that, so I think it's a response to that. He's taking us back to Genesis, not to say that because the man was created first, the man has to be the authority, nor can it be that the woman is somehow inferior or somehow more dangerous because she was deceived.
That's right.
I actually think Paul here is speaking sarcastically. Like he does in 2 Corinthians 11, the only other place in the Bible outside of Genesis 3 where Eve is mentioned in having been deceived. And in 2 Corinthians 11, Paul says, I'm concerned that you might easily be led astray, like Eve was led astray. Is he really concerned? No. That's the whole reason he wrote those letters to the Corinthians, is to correct them and how easily they are deceived. I wonder if he's not speaking a bit sarcastically here, because there's nothing in the biblical text anywhere that says hierarchy is rooted in the order in which people are created. But you might say, but I'm not convinced. That's okay.
Yeah.
Let me go backwards a moment and then forwards a moment. In a moment, the command in 1 Timothy 2 is found in verse 11. Want women to learn. And in a culture where women haven't been trained, remember again, 50 years into our history, before women were admitted to Dallas Seminary. This is a bit shocking. That Paul says women should be taught, women should learn in quietness and full submission, because men should learn in quietness and full submission too. And then we're back to once women are trained, then they need opportunities to use their education. And so I think in 1 Corinthians and in 1 Timothy, Paul is encouraging women and men to learn to be able to use those gifts. That when he says, I don't permit a woman to teach or exercise authority, I think he's referring, and there are all kinds of other options here. Woman could be wives and husbands, because there's no word that's difference between woman and wife. It might be a specific woman he has in view because it's a singular, but my view actually is, excuse me, that women who haven't been trained should not be teaching. But once women have been trained, then they should be teaching because they have been trained to teach. Women are, and they assume, or could be translated, usurp authority. The same is true of men. Men should not be usurping authority either. I mean, when I walk into a classroom, I'm the authority in that classroom. And if somebody in the classroom says, no, I want to be in charge, it doesn't matter whether that person is a man or a woman, that would be out of line. And then verse 15, women will be saved through childbearing. I think this actually is a reminder that women throughout history have been seen as dangerous because they are easily deceived, because they are seductresses, which is the basic.
That's why they should stay home and raise the kids only?
Because that would not be dangerous.
So the 15, it's meaning that because you're dangerous, so you better just stay home and take care of the kids and manage the home. Is that what is?
And that doesn't make any sense. So one of the articles I wrote, I demonstrated that throughout history, women in Christian literature, but outside of Christian literature, have been seen as either easily deceived, which is why they can't lead, or they are deceivers, they are seductive, they are dangerous.
yeah.
You can't have it both ways, and maybe both of those are wrong.
Yeah.
So what is in view here? I think this is Paul's reminding us and reminding women that salvation comes through the seed of a woman without the help of any man, that men and women are saved through childbearing, through the birth of the Messiah, who is virgin born. Salvation is always, this is another one of those conditional statements, if they continue in faith, love, and holiness. There's a number of those in the New Testament as well. My colleague, because Artemis, Sandy gone, because Artemis was the goddess of life and childbearing, she argues that this is a promise to the women in Ephesus that becoming a Christian does not mean that you will not be saved or preserved through childbearing, but that God will preserve you in a way that Artemis never could. I don't hold that view because I don't think we should say to people, if you become a Christian, your baby will be delivered fine, because we know better than that. Because Christians and non-Christians.
Do you think the first 15 that says that Paul said to women, you will be saved through childbearing and just stay home, it's not a prescriptive, right? It is not like a direct command to women, Christian women, to stay home.
No, it's not that.
It's not that,
Yeah, I think it is to say to women and men that we are saved through childbirth, particularly the birth of one child. There might not be a more controversial text in all the Bible than that one. That verse has been used to say that women who don't have children are not fulfilling their job. It's been used to argue that the reason why women are on the planet is to have babies. It's been used in really dangerous ways. So that my view is just one of many. I think it's the right one, or I would change my mind. I think it's a reference to the virgin birth. That sin, for years, women have been blamed for the fall. When, if we read Genesis 3, the man and the woman are co-conspirators in the rebellion against God. And the irony is that salvation comes through a man who comes to us through a woman without the help of
That's
a man.
right. That's right.
This is what my friend Lillian Callis Barger calls Eve's revenge. Having been blamed for the fall, she is the means of salvation.
That's right. Yeah, the bearer of the Messiah. That's right. Yeah.
But in no way, in my view, to answer your question directly, in no way does verse 12 make a universal command, and 13, a universal command that women can never be in positions of authority or teaching. And just to be clear about this, I teach at an institution that has women faculty members, women administrators, and even women on the board. And in our institutional structure, the board is the highest authority. So this is what we believe here.
How about in a church setting, Dr. Kreider, if women is let's say a pastor, but not a senior pastor, not an elder, but she is in a position of leadership and then have authority of, for example, male volunteers. What's your view? Is it okay if that's the case?
Yeah, it's okay with me. I'm more interested in the competency and quality of the person in leadership than their sex.
Gender,
But there are people in our tradition who would make a distinction there, who would say, in a parachurch organization like a seminary, in a mission agency, then it would be okay for women to be in positions of authority. But the church would be different. I don't, with the exception of senior pastor and elder, I don't see any restrictions on that. And that I know women who are in leadership positions. They generally are paid less than men, and they generally have titles that are a little bit different. We're still in the process of changing those things. The wage gap is a challenging one. But the title gap is too. And it's not that titles really do matter that much, but if a man doing the job has the title of pastor and a woman doing the same job has the title of director or minister, there's a clear distinction being made. I don't see any reason why women, as long as they're not elders, that women can't be in positions of authority in leading teams of people in ministry. That's a challenge for some men who are chauvinists and who are patriarchal, who believe the man always has to be in charge. And that kind of a worldview, that kind of an ethos, is deeply embedded in the culture in the United States of America, particularly in the South, that it will take some time to grow and change. I'm hopeful. As I look at my children's generation, who are they're not considerably younger than me. My son is almost 30, and my daughter's 40. Their generation is much more open and much more aware of equality and opportunities for all.
Right.
And I think the future of the church in the States is positive and healthy.
Yeah. So as a closing, Dr. Kreider, what would you say to the English-speaking Christians in Indonesia that will hear this, especially to men and women, Christian men and women? What would you give a message? What would you like to encourage them to do?
Without presuming to be able to speak to the culture, here's what I would say: that the gospel, the need for the gospel is so great, that the opportunities for ministry are so great, that we should be looking for those opportunities for both men and women, and in Christian institutions and in organizations where there is discomfort with men in a particular position or women in a particular position. You should be looking for opportunities. In the States, it's increasingly difficult for men to serve in children's ministry because of the fear that men would be pedophiles, would be abusers. The great irony is that women abuse too. So that I think there are, I think the need is great, the opportunities are great, and I say to women all the time in the United States of America, don't be held back by the rules that are placed upon you. I would love to see more opportunities in the church for women in the States. But until that happens, use the opportunities that are in front of you. Some of my greatest fulfillment as a prof at Dallas Seminary is that there are several pretty well-known ministries that have been started by women who I've impacted, and I would hope to see something very similar happen where the need is great. The gospel is the great answer to our need. The need for the gospel is great, and the opportunities are endless for people who want to serve.
That's a very wise closing message to believers, English-speaking believers in Indonesia, that the gospel should be the focus of men and women, Christian men and women, that we join hands together to become the minister of the gospel. Thank you so much, Dr. Glenn Kreider, for your time and for enlightening us some of the cultural issues and theological understanding. Appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you.